Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to my co-panelists here. I had thought when we were originally drawing up this, I thought that it was going to be a terrifically difficult case to make, that there is some hope for diplomacy, and I think I agree with those on the other side of the table that there is increasing hope, but I'm going to try my best to pour cold water on that increasing hope, despite the fact that I'm very, very much a supporter of diplomacy. I think I would support a much more ambitious diplomatic approach than is likely to happen. But I'll explain some of the obstacles in terms of American domestic politics and in terms of sort of structural international reasons in the international system. I should also reveal that I was doing work on Iranian potential proliferation in 2006 and 2007, but for the past year or so I've been working on the Asia-Pacific region. So I'm actually having to pivot back to the Middle East, as I think the administration is having to pivot back to the Middle East. So I will defer on many recent developments to my co-panelists. You have to say, though, the good thing about U.S.-Iran or Western Iranian diplomacy is that there are really good metaphors. There are zones of immunity, closing windows, clocks running at different speeds. It's like the Salvador Dali painting of nuclear proliferation. So again, I want to reiterate, I favor diplomacy. As I'll reveal at the end, I favor probably an unrealistically ambitious diplomatic approach, but it's the very fact that that approach is unrealistic that causes me to doubt whether or not we will get where we want to go. As I mentioned, Ali covered quite well, I think, some of the Iranian obstacles to a diplomatic resolution of the problem. I want to focus on U.S. domestic politics and on some structural impediments, and then suggest where we might go from here to prove me wrong. So in terms of American domestic politics, the general aphorism that I've been trying to get out into the public zeitgeist is that what might work can't happen, and what might happen can't work. And I think that that's a fairly glum assessment, and I hope that I'm wrong about it, but that's what I believe at this point. As Barbara mentioned, the Congress's attitude has been, let's add more pressure on top of the existing pressure and promise not to put any more pressure if concessions are made. And in fact, it's even stopped that last part of not putting any more pressure. The central bank sanctions, for example, the Congress did not write an off-ramp in for Iran to say, and oh, by the way, if you fulfill these 57 demands that we're making, we'll remove these sanctions. So if you're Iranian and you're looking at what Congress is doing and saying, all right, well, what are the demands here that we could fulfill conceivably that would give us a way out of this? The Congress has stopped, by and large, even gesturing at the idea of an off-ramp. So I think that's something of an indication of the role that Congress intends to play. I'm pretty much a partisan of Congress as an institution, but they have really not covered themselves in glory, I think, with their participation in U.S. diplomacy toward Iran. My read of what the Congress is up to is that they want to appear very, very concerned to various interested constituencies about the problem, and that's about it. I mean, the one saving grace that we may have is that as an institution, they are cowardly enough to ignore the power granted to them in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which indeed grants them the power to declare war. We used to do that as a country, declare war when the Congress decided that war was appropriate. But instead now we've reverted to lots of hand-waving and table-pounding, which perversely I think is probably a good thing. So the Congress, I think, again, often does some boneheaded things to get its oar in the lake of U.S.-Iran diplomacy, but they have not really provided hope or anything constructive, I think, to the diplomatic agenda that the administration is following. As for the Obama administration itself, you've got to give it credit. It put its neck out there by on the campaign saying that it was open to diplomacy, by in 2009 gesturing in the direction of diplomacy. But I perceive not too terribly much interest in spending gobs and gobs of political capital on getting diplomacy with Iran up and running in a way that will be fruitful. I can't entirely blame them for that. It's not clear to me that they have enough political capital left, particularly this year, to get things rolling in a fruitful direction. And obviously, we've all noticed with the goings on at the Supreme Court, they have lots of domestic priorities on which they're spending political capital. So I don't envy the position in which the Obama administration finds itself. And I think, to echo what some of the other panelists have said, any diplomatic process that has the hope of producing long-term results would be itself a long-term, protracted process of meetings after meetings after meetings that would be easy to sort of demagogue as the Obama administration selling out to the Islamic Republic. I mean, the campaign commercials rather write themselves. So I think that's a politically perilous thing for the administration to do. And for a variety of reasons, I will defer to Michael Adler gladly on this and hope that he's right. I'm not sure that the Israelis were as well received to President Obama's message. Again, I remain open to being persuaded that that's right, but I wonder whether it is. So moving on to sort of the structural international obstacles, I'm really indebted to reminding me of the insight to one of the panelists on the second panel, Nuno Montero, who has a forthcoming paper where he mentions this topic. But to start with, the dyad, as the political science kids call it, the relationship between Iran on the one hand and the United States on the other hand is terrifically imbalanced in terms of material power. Iran cannot conquer the United States. The United States, if it decided to, could conquer Iran. It would be a big mess. I don't support doing so. But in terms of material power, there's simply no comparing the two countries. So given that, if you look at things from Iran's perspective, any diplomatic deal would involve making lots of substantial security assurances to Iran. If you do this, not only will we do something on the one hand, but we also agree not to do something in the future. So the question becomes, how could Iran trust assurances provided by a country that has overwhelming power, and indeed I believe is still a unipolar power in the international system? How do you make credible assurances to a relatively weak state as a unipolar power that, if it decided to, could renege on those assurances at any point? This is a point that I think is not terribly well grasped, or at least I don't see evidence that it is very well grasped by the administration or certainly by the Congress. It's just very difficult, no matter how genuine the intention, to credibly convey that to a country with which, coming from both sides, there have been poisonous relations for the past 30-odd years. This is, I think, a very important point to highlight. And President Obama, in a recent interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, pointed to cases where he thought diplomacy had produced good results in terms of nuclear nonproliferation. And he pointed, of course, at South Africa and then pointed at Libya. Well, if you're Ayatollah Khamenei and you look at the Libya deal and say, well, we could get ourselves a Libya deal here. What about that? It doesn't look like a very good deal. Because, again, the United States could very easily renege on assurances that were made if, for example, there were another political crackdown, Iran has credibly denuclearized, and the United States decides that it's had just about enough of a dictatorial regime in Tehran cracking down on protesting civilians. So I think getting our heads around how to convey credibly security assurances is maybe my sort of Sunday punch here in terms of pouring cold water on the prospect for a long-term diplomatic deal that works. So, I want to reiterate, just in case someone perished the thought would quote me out of context, I favor diplomacy. I favor a very robust diplomatic approach to Iran. But I worry, again, that what might happen can't work and what might work can't happen. So in terms of where from here, in wrapping up, I'll offer a couple of thoughts about how to prove me wrong. We have this peculiar belief in the United States that when we win concessions at the UN Security Council to do another resolution sanctioning Iran or what have you, that there's a sort of or else on the other side of that in terms of the people that have signed on to the deal, right? So we censure Iran for doing this and it should stop. And in our mind, we have an or else at the end of that statement, or else we will force you to stop. And I think that the rest of the world really doesn't have an or else on the end of the Security Council resolutions or any other statements. So I think we should sort of get our mind around that. If we decide that there's going to be an or else, it's going to be us and possibly a very, very small coalition of the willing, to coin a phrase, that tries to put teeth into these sanctions militarily, should it come to that. I think it's particularly odd that lots of conservatives who have particular views about the United Nations tend to endorse the idea that the Security Council sanctions should bite in important ways. I think we would probably have to make large, probably prohibitively large concessions at the outset to get Iranians to believe that we're serious about diplomacy. If you look at 1737, 1747, I think it's probably unlikely that Iran is going to agree to suspend outright, as those indicate. And I think we would probably have to do something in terms of the unilateral sanctions from Washington or from Europe in order to convince the Iranians that we were serious. I also think that's probably a political non-starter. If you could get them to do something like stop enriching to 20%, I would be willing to walk back some of the things that we're doing, not just to promise not to do anything in addition, but indeed to walk back some of the things that we're already doing to try to credibly convince them that we were serious. It would be a political nightmare. Or just one other thing that we could do is if they, particularly if they agreed to stop enhancing the COM facility, the Fordo facility, that would be terrific. And I would take that as a sign that we should be willing to walk back some of the things that we're already doing. This is not a mainstream point of view. I've not heard it from the administration or from the Congress, and I think it would be a political nightmare. But there again, I think you see the domestic political influences constraining our ability to operate internationally. But the net takeaway, I think, is that if you really want diplomacy to work, and if you really think that a military option is a terrible idea, you're going to have to really bite the bullet, so to speak, and do some things that you really would rather not do in order to get the train rolling in the first place. And in the second place, realize that this is going to be a long, agonizing process that's going to have lots of setbacks and may not in the end work. I hope that we get that far, but I fear that we will not. So I think I'll just leave it there and then turn the podium back over to Chris to field questions. Thank you very much.